Good morning. Today, Canada's Conservatives are demanding that Justin Trudeau release the secret documents that he's been hiding from Canadians. These documents are about the transfer of Ebola and Hennepin viruses to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in March 2019. The documents also contain information about scientists with ties to the Chinese military who had their security clearance revoked and were fired after the transfer. Aujourd'hui, les conservateurs du Canada demandent que Justin Trudeau publie les documents secrets qu'il a cachés aux Canadiens. Ces documents portent sur le transfert des virus Ebola et Nipah à l'Institut de virologie de Wuhan en mars 2019. Et les scientifiques qui ont des liens avec les têtes communistes chinoises qui ont vu ensuite leur habilitation de sécurité révoquée et ont été licenciés après ce transfert. Depuis des années, les services canadiens de sécurité ont mis en garde le gouvernement et les universités contre les risques de coopérer avec la Chine communiste en matière de recherche. For years, Canada's security services have been warning the government and universities about the risk of research cooperation with Communist China. How could two scientists with deep connections to the Chinese military be able to gain access to a high-level Canadian security-cleared laboratory with access to the world's most dangerous viruses, like Ebola? This security breach and how the government of Mr. Trudeau is trying to hide the truth is deeply troubling. Unfortunately, this cover-up should come as no surprise to Canadians. Malheureusement, ce camouflage ne devrait pas surprendre les Canadiens. Dès sa première année comme Premier ministre, M. Trudeau s'est fait attraper lors d'activités de financement avec les dirigeants chinois. Prime Minister Trudeau reversed a decision to block the sale of a Canadian security firm, ITF Technologies, to a Chinese state-owned enterprise. ITF Technologies had contracts with the Pentagon and our closest allies, yet the Trudeau cabinet approved this Chinese corporate takeover despite repeated warnings from Canada's national security agencies. Mr. Trudeau also has refused to ban Huawei from our critical 5G infrastructure, despite being the only Five Eyes country that has not already acted. For years, he has promised action, promised a decision, but Canadians are once again left unprotected, and our closest allies view Canada as a security risk. But what's even more concerning is the length the Liberals are going to cover up the details about the transfer of these dangerous viruses to China. C'est l'héritage de Justin Trudeau. This is Mr. Trudeau's legacy. More cover-ups, more scandals, more of the same. There's only one choice to secure Canada's future and the transparency Canadians deserve, and that's Canada's Conservative Party. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
And questions, starting with questions on the phone. As usual, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions, commençant par des questions au téléphone. Comme à l'habitude, une question suivie par journaliste. Opératrice, avons-nous une première question?
Thank you. Merci. La première question est de Hélène Buzetti de l'Éco-op de l'information. La parole est à vous.
Oui, bonjour, M. O'Toole. J'aimerais revenir à cette idée là que vous dites on veut avoir plus d'informations concernant le transfert du virus Ebola vers la Chine. J'aimerais savoir qu'est-ce que vous craignez exactement, parce que bon, la Chine, c'est quand même un pays reconnu, là, avec toutes sortes de préoccupations, mais êtes-vous en train de dire qu'une fois qu'il serait en possession de ce virus, il pourrait faire de la guerre bactériologique? C'est quoi votre crainte exactement? Merci.
Merci pour la question, Hélène. On a des questions raisonnables sur la situation avec le laboratoire à Winnipeg. Selon moi, c'était totalement inapproprié pour les scientifiques avec les liens entre avec les têtes chinoises communistes et les militaires chinoises d'avoir accès dans une lab sécuritaire. On a des questions sur ça. On a posé au comité, la comité Chine-Canada, mais aussi on va poser les mêmes questions aujourd'hui pour la sécurité des Canadiens et Canadiennes.
Oui, je comprends ce que vous dites et j'ai bien compris votre argumentaire, mais la crainte, elle est où, là? Admettons, bon, OK, que ces scientifiques-là ont des contacts inappropriés avec des autorités chinoises, ont eu accès à des virus extrêmement mortels, les auraient transférés vers la Chine. Après, c'est quoi votre crainte? Qu'est-ce que la Chine, pourquoi est-ce qu'il faudrait s'inquiéter que la Chine ait eu accès à ça?
On doit examiner nos processus chez nous parce que maintenant, il y a une enquête globale en ce qui concerne l'origine de le virus coronavirus. Il y a beaucoup de questions sur le laboratoire à Wuhan. Le président Biden vient d'annoncer une enquête sur ça et on doit participer. Et on a des questions sur le processus chez nous, particulièrement dans le laboratoire à Winnipeg.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. La prochaine question est de Raymond Filion de TVA. La parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour, M. O'Toole. J'aimerais savoir comment vous réagissez à cette décision d'Air Canada de payer des millions de dollars en prime à ses dirigeants au moment où l'entreprise réclamait l'aide du fédéral et mettait des milliers d'employés à pied.
Merci, Raymond. En octobre, on a demandé un plan pour le secteur touristique et pour les entreprises aériennes. Malheureusement, le gouvernement de M. Trudeau était lent avec leur programme d'aide. On a dit que ce n'est pas approprié d'avoir l'argent des contribuables pour les salaires ou pour les bonus. On doit protéger les emplois, les routes régionaux, et on a proposé quelques mesures pour ça. Mais malheureusement, comme j'ai dit, le gouvernement de M. Trudeau était lent et on a perdu beaucoup d'emplois dans le secteur à cause de ça.
Okay, vous dites que le gouvernement était lent, mais moi, je vous pose la question à savoir comment vous réagissez face à cette décision d'Air Canada de payer des millions en prime à ses dirigeants et aussi que doit faire le gouvernement Trudeau devant cette situation-là, selon vous?
Selon moi, ce n'est pas approprié d'utiliser l'argent des contribuables pour les salaires des dirigeants dans le secteur privé. On doit travailler ensemble après la pandémie pour une relance économique. On doit cibler sur les emplois pour les travailleurs comme les pilotes et les autres, et pas des bonus ou des salaires pour les dirigeants. Est-ce que le Premier ministre a demandé une approche contre les paiements comme ça? On a des questions.
Opératrice, prochaine question.
Merci. Thank you. The next question is from Stephen Chase from the Globe and Mail. Please go ahead. Your line is now open.
Oh, hi. It's Steve Chase here. I was going to ask you about, just going back to the motion, the Public Health Agency's president, Ian Stewart, and some of the Liberals have been talking about perhaps this wouldn't be better dealt with by the National Security and Intelligence Committee, which, of course, is not a committee of Parliament. But they're making that argument that documents should go there because that's a committee set up to handle this. Can you address that?
That's a false argument that they're using to continue their cover-up, Steve. The Canada-China Specialized Committee, a committee I was involved in creating, has twice asked for access to these documents to fulfill their mandate. Parliament has a right to hold the government to account. We've seen that supported throughout our democratic years as a country, and Mr. Trudeau cannot evade reasonable questions about the security of Canadians. An NCI COP is meant to have a high-level, long-term analysis of our security agencies and the evolving threat. It does not stop Parliament from being able to ask questions about Mr. Trudeau's government permitting scientists with deep links to the Chinese military to have access to our highest security lab in the country. These are reasonable questions, at a time where the entire world is asking questions about the Wuhan laboratory. So I hope the Trudeau government stops the cover-up here and does not try and use NCI-COP in a political fashion.
What would be the downside of using NCI-COP? And that I was hoping to shoehorn in the question of whether or not you believe you're going to get support from the PQ and the NDP.
First, I do believe we'll get support from the other opposition parties because this is such a fundamental question at a time the country for almost a year and a half has been fighting through a health and economic crisis. We have some serious questions about apparent breach of security protocol and an ongoing disconnect between Mr. Trudeau and the reality of the communist regime in Beijing. NCI-COP is meant to be a nonpartisan oversight committee for our security agencies and issues. The Trudeau government cannot use this committee to hide from accountability in the House of Commons. We've seen with the Afghan detainee documents, Parliament has a right to get these documents to fulfill our duties to hold Mr. Trudeau to account. He doesn't like being held to account on health documents, on the cover-up in national defense. They're filibustering literally every committee of Parliament, Steve, because we have a corrupt government that doesn't want to be held to account. We will hold them to account.
And we'll now take questions in the room. David?
I'm Mr. O'Toole, David Thurton, CBC News. I wanted to ask you about the border. You had that expert panel last week who basically said that, you know, the border measures that the government has imposed, the quarantine measures, you know, don't really work. What is your view on this issue? The government says it needs to talk with, you know, the provinces on this, the territories on this. How do you think Canada should proceed on the border?
Thank you, David. As you mentioned, I was very proud the Conservatives created the Canada-US Committee to look at issues from the border right through to Buy American and our declining impact in Washington. We see softwood lumber tariffs targeted. We see the agricultural sector targeted. There's a lot of questions about the declining relationship. With respect to the border itself, we need a national plan of rapid screening and testing so that when we can open safely and swiftly, it can be done in a secure way where people can have a rapid test to provide certainty when they're entering at a port of entry. The same approach had the federal government would apply to cruise ships and other things in the coming months, that if Canada is bypassed, if we don't have a plan for a safe and data-driven reopening, we will see prolonged economic downturn post-vaccines, and I don't think any Canadian wants to see that.
When it comes to the measures of international travelers coming into Canada, isolating, doing that mandatory hotel quarantine, the report cited problems with that. Do you think we just need to get rid of that and just have, as you said, rapid testing, more testing, and just let people figure out their own quarantine plan as long as we have that testing in place?
We've said from the beginning, we had serious problems with the completely flawed and unsecured hoteling quarantine project of Mr. Trudeau that wasn't followed, that had some horrendous security breaches, and wasn't fulfilling the job. Canadian citizens and permanent residents could easily have a monitored by a health official quarantine policy in their own home. Travelers from hotspot countries should not be traveling here anyway. That's how the variants got in, because Mr. Trudeau was lax on that. And then non-PR, non-residents would have to have a detailed plan as part of their entry. This is not rocket science, but sadly, with everything the government has touched during this pandemic, it's confused, it's slow, and it's cumbersome. So there should be a quarantining provision at homes that can easily be checked in on by public health officials across the country.
Next question, Man.
Hello, Mr. O'Toole. Man Hamidi with the Canadian Press. You're celebrating the start of the Pride Month today, yet it's mostly MPs from your party who are opposing the Bill C6. And I wonder, how can the Conservative Party ask for support from the LGBT community in Canada, where some of your MPs are opposing this bill?
Well, I just launched my Pride video as leader of the Conservative Party celebrating some of the success the community has done to advance cause, advance equality rights over many, many decades, going back to before I was born. There's more work to do, and that's what my call to action is in our video. I'm very proud of some of the advocacy of MPs in our caucus on pushing on the blood ban that prevents gay men from participating in blood donation in an unfair and unbacked up by science way. On bills, we try and always have a reasonable and respectful approach to examining all legislation in the House, and that will be our policy on all issues. But June is a month that we can celebrate Pride.
Follow-up, doesn't you think that the opposition coming only from conservative MPs send a message that to the LGBT community and survivors of conversion therapy that your party still welcomes those who doesn't support them?
Our party opposes conversion therapy and the harm that process and compelling someone to try and change who they are, it can tear at their soul, and our party opposes that. The debates in Parliament are meant to be debates where we can say, is the bill itself, is the legislation going to address that harm that we all recognize in a way that helps people affected, helps the victims and prevents new victims from being created, and doesn't expand into areas where it's limiting conversations, these sorts of things. As leader of the party, I'm pro-LGBTQ rights, I'm pro-choice, and I always make sure that we have an informed and respectful approach to our debate in the House. It's the standard I hold myself to. It's the standard I hold my MPs to.